just like to start on two procedural notes as a self-proclaimed economist pretending to be a lawyer. I'll say that my opinions expressed there are not representative of the Telecoms Authority, the Intellectual Property Office, or any other state body or otherwise. And secondly, there's a lot of content in my presentation. My understanding is that the presentations will be made available for participants afterwards. So I'll skip through a lot of the content under the assumption that you can always come back to it and check it out afterwards. So the starting point is the reality that Caribbean economies have a dependence on primary production, which is subject to price volatility, rentier behavior, inequalities in income distribution, and an erosion of sociocultural institutions. This is further made worse by a historically entrenched dependence on foreign knowledge, culture, and commodities. So the goal at hand is economic diversification and a move towards sustainable development strategies through evidence-based policy formulation. This means a holistic approach which embraces the cultural and social elements of the concept of development. And what we need to do is to consider the microeconomic effects of the changing technological and cultural trends and what the macroeconomic potential of these industries are. So in this sense, we need to redefine what we think is defined as an economic resource, and that means we will have a reevaluation of the areas in which we perceive we have a comparative advantage. So I will be presenting on strengthening the creative industries with specific reference to ICTs and IPRs, that is, information communication technologies and intellectual property rights, respectively. So there will be a focus on the idea of digital content. To start, the creative industries are the economic sector. Dr. Burke spoke a lot about this, but in essence, we're talking about a sector that lies on the crossroads between arts, business, and technology, where there's a strong mutually reinforcing relationship amongst different artistic and economically distinct activities, ranging from upstream activities such as traditional arts, performing arts, literature, visual arts, and downstream activities such as advertising, design, and publishing, where these latter applied arts are much closer to the market and commercial application of traditional cultural activities. Dr. Berg also spoke about the various models we have here. What you can see is there are various definitions and models of what actually constitutes the creative industries. And this definitely is a big area of debate. It's very academic, it's very semantic, but I think that the conclusions all lead to similar policy recommendations at their core. So the creative industries are the economic sector, although there's so many different definitions, the common thread is that we're talking about cycles of creation, production, and distribution of goods and services that use creativity and intellectual capital as primary inputs. These industries constitute a set of knowledge-based activities focused not only on arts, and potentially generate revenues from trade and intellectual property. Most importantly, they constitute a new and dynamic sector in world trade. So looking at international trade flows of creative goods and services, what we can see is a trend very reminiscent of what we call in economics the resource curse. Is this paradox that the developing world has this high endowment of cultural and creative resources, and yet we are net importers of cultural goods and services. So to put this into perspective, we have to look at the history of trade policy in respect of creative goods and services. And these debates really culminated in the Uruguay round, which led to the formation of the WTO, where France led the European Union in a bitter exchange over the regulation of audiovisual industries against the US. In order to ensure that the negotiations did not collapse as deadlines approached, the two parties conceded that audiovisual sector will not be incorporated into the GATT, but will be incorporated in the devolving GATTs, which would allow for much more flexibility in terms of commitment schedules by parties. The prevailing arguments put forward by France were premised on the idea of cultural exception, which proposes that cultural goods and services should be fundamentally treated differently in international trade, as they are vectors of identity and instruments of national heritage. There are clearly two diametrically opposed perspectives on the role of cultural industries in international trade. One which suggests that they go beyond economic commodities and should be treated differently, and the other which argued that there's no such distinction. And it's noted that trade positions tend to mirror these academic debates. Also, a good reference point is the Canadian perspective, which long predates the GATTs, where Canadian negotiators were actually willing to jeopardize the entire free trade agreements between Canada and the US on the fact that they wanted exceptions for the treatment of cultural goods and services. This was predating NAFTA. So the implication here is that in order to understand the relationship between culture and trade, we must conceive that there's a trade-off between cultural costs of economic liberalization. So cultural exemption from international trade agreements should be seen as promoting a balanced approach in the multilateral system, allowing countries to minimize this cultural cost of liberalization. One author notes that there are three principal approaches to the issue of trade policy and culture, which emerge from the Uruguay round in going forward. There can be 1, cultural exception; 2, a cultural specificity clause; or 3, an international agreement on cultural diversity, which leads us to the UNESCO Convention on the Protection and Promotion of Cultural Diversity, which emerged in 2005. This can largely be seen as the international community's response to these debates on the interface between culture and trade. And in essence, this is a very bold step forward because the convention's primary objective is to strengthen the 5 links of the same chain: creation, production, distribution, access, and enjoyment of cultural expressions conveyed by cultural activities, goods, and services, particularly in developing countries. The preamble refers to the need to incorporate culture as a strategic element in national and international developmental policies. And why this is so important is because before these, many of these policies may have been seen as conflicting with the existing status quo of the multilateral trade system. However, Article 2, the principle of sovereignty of the Convention, states that states have, in accordance with the Charter of the UN and the principles of international law, the sovereign right to adopt measures and policies to protect and to promote the diversity of cultural expressions in their territory. And of course, in going forward, the big issue is likely to be how are policy options pursuant to the convention going to interface with existing WTO rules. However, a comparison of WTO commitment schedules and UNESCO membership suggests that being party to the convention is compatible with liberalization of key sectors. So one author notes that this shift from cultural exemption arguments towards the concept of cultural diversity is not just semantic. It reflects a more holistic approach to the idea of the interface between culture and trade. So just to look at some CARICOM states and the current status on the UNESCO Convention. Very timely, on July 26th of this year, Trinidad and Tobago deposited its instruments of ratification to the Convention. In accordance with Article 29, the Convention will enter into force on the 26th of this month. We should thus expect that the country should now be, hopefully, well on its way to articulate a coherent strategy to leverage the provisions of the UNESCO Convention to strengthen the domestic creative economy. Also, to add another layer, we have the economic partnership agreement between CARIFORUM and the European Community, which has certain provisions in the Protocol 3 on cultural cooperation. Pay special attention to item 2, technical assistance for cultural industry policy implementation. Very important. So the annexing of Protocol 3 to the EPA was a very historic move in that it marks the first time the UNESCO Convention was being used to justify giving cultural goods and services special treatment in a trade agreement. And also the protocol expresses the intention of all parties to the EPA to implement the UNESCO Convention. So in going forward, what I'm trying to stress is that in strengthening creative industries, it's going to be important to leverage the opportunities provided under the UNESCO Convention, as well as maintaining our commitment flexibilities under the GATS and the assistance opportunities under the EPA. So the big question, Dr. Burke well referred to this too, is what is the GDP contribution of the creative industries? We've been asking this for years. I did not even bother to quote a number here because, to be honest, we really don't know. We do have estimates, but in my opinion, a lot of these research are likely to be underestimates because there's a strong lack of institutional capacity in the collection and documentation of statistical information in the creative sectors. This is also because of a lack of consensus on a coherent definition of what exactly the creative industries consist of in the region. Also, the seasonal nature of many of the primary markets, example, festival tourism, means that there's a transient nature of creative activities. And also the informal nature of many forms of activities means that production is outside of a context of explicit commercial intentions. So this lack of empirical data creates a fundamental problem Firstly, in justifying the creative industries as a viable option for diversification, and secondly, developing evidence-based policy strategies. So addressing these deficiencies in statistical systems must be an